So this video is going to talk a little bit about my life outside of YouTube and some of the research I've been doing. I'm going to provide a link below this video to a specific essay I just finished a few days ago. An essay that deals with the political history of the area overlapping between Russia, Japan, and China. Many people aren't even aware that Russia and Japan have a direct border, but they do. And for some periods of history, they had a land border rather than just an oceanic border. And that border has shifted back and forth in all three directions. I think even still today, all three countries would dispute where the border should be between China and Russia, between Russia and Japan. The article itself, if you just want to glance at it, it does have quite a few illustrations. I took the time to add as many pictures as I could. And taking a glance at just the first few illustrations on the map of where I'm talking about is fine. I mean, just say don't feel bad about just having a glance at it rather than reading it. I would say if you don't want to read the whole thing, you might want to skip to section 5. Section 5 is where it starts really talking about the atrocities, the crimes against humanity, mass murder, mass rape, and so on. So on this channel, many times I've alluded to the fact that I study political extremism. And this is maybe the first time when I've given you guys a direct finger pointing to an example of something I've written about political extremism. And it's something I've just written now rather than something I wrote a few years ago in Cambodia or what have you. And actually, I'd add too, although Cambodia is mentioned, I managed to mention Cambodia in almost everything I do. But, all of the information in this particular essay, this is all stuff I learned within the last 2 years. 2 years ago, I knew much less about Russia than I know today, much less about Japan. And, I knew quite a lot about China, but I know even more about Chinese politics now. So one thing that may be interesting for my kind of regular viewers, my vegan viewers, there are a few different ways in which this essay actually connects to what I say and do about veganism and animal rights. For one thing, one of the reasons why I'm against political extremism is because I have this kind of depth of historical knowledge about real political extremism in praxis. And, this shows even in my resistance to sort of cynical and insincere poses of people pretending to be extremists when they're really not. Because, a lot of what goes on in animal rights of people pretending to be anarchists or putting on masks or pretending to be extremists. I think a lot of the people involved know that they're not going to do anything any more dangerous than dressing up like a cow and marching up and down the main street in front of the Parliament building in the city they live in. So, sometimes there's a sense of silliness mixed in with the sort of phony radicalism. But even on my blog before I had this YouTube channel, and still now on this YouTube channel, I really oppose that. I really say, no, let's be rigorous and responsible. Let's say what we mean and mean what we say. And let's think about the implications of what it is we're struggling for and how we're struggling for it in a democratic society. So with that aside, say a few words about what makes this particular essay interesting, even for someone who has no particular research interest in this part of Asia or this period of Asian history. So these events transpired in the year 1920. In many ways in 1920, communism was still a new idea. The Russian Revolution begins in 1917, or 1917 is the most famous year, I suppose. In some ways it began years earlier. In 1920, someone who was watching the events within Russia very carefully would have already had a sense of just how strongly communism really was connected to mass murder, to violence on an unbelievable scale, to persecution door to door, including ethnic persecution, including genocide or crimes that resemble genocide so closely there's no point in digressing to redefine the term. However, the vast majority of the world was still basically optimistic about communism. And when you're talking about Asia, there were problems of translation in the most literal sense. It was not easy for people in Japan to understand what was happening in Europe during World War I. Why would it be easy? It's a huge challenge. And Japan really was involved with World War I in a big way, including the peace conferences at the end of World War I. So for people in Japan to understand Russian politics, or for Russians to understand Japanese politics, this is already difficult. So this particular massacre in 1920, in some ways, for the Japanese especially, but maybe for all of East Asia, for Japan, Korea, and China, this was one of the first big wake-up calls when they realized communism is not just about human equality, communism is not just about organizing labor unions. Communism, the stuff they're saying about class warfare, it really does involve mass murder. Now, the case study is fascinating in many ways. This is about one particular town where particular mass murder happened. The Bolsheviks, so this is the Russian communist side, the Bolsheviks, before they came to the town, before they conquered it, on their march there, they were instructed and they discussed among themselves the fact that what they were going to do involved murdering children, murdering children and infants. This was part of the job. Now, the fact that they knew that and talked about it in advance makes sense, both in terms of organization and the sort of Machiavellian and psychological aspect. You wouldn't want to, as the commander of that unit, have them be very much surprised or have rebellion or dissent among the troops if you only revealed that at the last minute or when it was too late. So in some ways it's natural and obvious that they were in effect training their soldiers, that they were not just going into combat against other soldiers, but that they were going to be exterminating civilian men, women, and children. But a detail like that is so important because it again shows these were premeditated acts of mass murder. Class warfare really did mean killing members of rival classes, killing members of rival political parties, and that's exactly what you see unfold in tremendous detail in this case. In this case, after the town was destroyed, after so many people were killed, the survivors were able to escape to Japan because this happened, as I mentioned, right on the outermost edge where Russia meets Japan. And that's a tragic contrast to so many other incidents of mass murder, of massacre, that could never be examined this way and are never documented for history in this way, just because the witnesses disappeared with it, or there wasn't a sort of international spotlight shone on it. To give the inevitable example of Cambodia, the main reason why we know so much about mass murder in Cambodia is what happened after. Is that after Cambodia was conquered by Vietnam, and then you had a rival political institution, you had a Vietnamese government who were trying to justify their own political situation by showing the world how terrible the events in Cambodia were. Now, I'm not saying what they did was phony, it wasn't at all. I think actually the vast majority of what the Vietnamese published at that time still holds up as, true, that they were publishing, terrible truths about mass murder and persecution in Cambodia. But my point is, in most cases, you would have this type of persecution, huge numbers of people killed. But if there isn't some sudden change, if there isn't something that brings foreign observers into the location where it happened, or that shatters the political status quo so that survivors and witnesses can escape to another country, then it won't be recorded for history in this way. Another detail that stood out for me personally was that when these communists were marching towards the town, they had a standard that if you wanted to be promoted to commissar, you had to kill 18 people each with your own hands, personally. And I do mean hands because they were killing people with swords, knives, bayonets, because ammunition was scarce. They had to conserve ammunition. So they were killing huge numbers of people. And even if you just think about that detail, the idea that men were told, in order to be promoted, you need to slaughter a lot of people. And then also there must be some reasoning behind that number, 18. It's not 10. 10 wasn't enough. At some point, they must have realized they were killing so many people that if it's only killing 10, then that's too low. So, somehow the number 18 was decided on by their leader. And that was set down in the orders. There's one other aspect, actually, of the essay that really does connect to what I've said here on YouTube. It talks about the psychological motivations for the people conducting these massacres. And I use an idiom that I've used here on YouTube, and that really comes from my speaking on YouTube, where I talk about sex, money, and fame as motivating people to do these terrible things. And I say, well, among the different soldiers and leaders and actors, those who weren't motivated by one of those three might be motivated by the other two, or some combination. And indeed, this essay has a whole section, has a chapter devoted to the issue of rape, including systematic use of rape in the communist revolution, in this atrocity, in this event, which is one of those things that even the most honest historians and sort of career academics, in a lot of ways, they just don't want to think about. So again, in this case, we had enough survivors and eyewitnesses immediately after it ended, including men who committed the atrocities. It's interesting. I could get into why that is, but there were men who participated in the atrocities, and who then at the very end led a rebellion against the communist leadership because they were opposed to these types of atrocities. And then those guys escaped because they thought they'd be killed by the Communist Party if they stayed in Russia, and they would have been. And so we actually get perspectives from both the victims and the perpetrators. So this is preserved for history. The question is, of course, is anyone learning from the history? And that's always the sort of sad and haunting thing that burdens me when I study this stuff, whether it's Cambodia or Laos, or in this case, this involves Russia, Japan, and China. I do come out of it feeling burdened, because in most of these cases, I may be the only man who speaks English who knows anything about the topic, or I may be the only man in my generation who knows anything about the topic, or, in the whole world, are there even 5 people who know about this topic? And that burdens you in a way that's very different from just sadness in looking back at this history. On my desk right now, this is a huge stack of paper of handwritten notes. I have more than that just from this year, a huge amount of writing by hand. And some of that, I have notes on Chinese history that indeed involves massacres under communism, under the Mao Zedong period. And I'm going through my possessions now. Most of what I own is going to be thrown in the garbage. I own some great books here that I'm not going to take with me to China. Most of what I own is all going to be thrown away. But emotionally, more than intellectually, I would feel bad throwing some of those handwritten notes in the garbage. And again, there's that tether of, if I don't keep this, if I don't study this, if I don't research this further or write about it further, who will? So yeah, as always on this channel, I like to emphasize the fact that this is not a purely rational exercise. There's an emotional component to it, but above and beyond all else, there are questions of principle. There is an ethical component to it.